Okay, so we are going to continue in the Bible. We're still in the Old Testament. Remember, stage 1 was the first few books of Genesis. So stage 1 was the primeval history, that time before written history. Stage 2 was the patriarchs. That was more chapters in Genesis. Then we get to stage 3. We did that on Friday with the Exodus from Egypt and how they had to wander in the desert. And then stage 4, they made it to the promised land and the judges. So now we are at stage 5, the kings and the prophets. And we're going to read about the exile and the return. So we are on page 30, stage 5, the kings and the prophets. The Old Testament also tells us about the 5th stage of salvation history, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and several books of the prophets tell us about these kingdoms. At the end of the book of Judges, the Israelites wanted their own king. God reluctantly answered their plea. He had Samuel, the last of the judges, anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. David followed Saul as the next king. David, a mighty warrior, united all 12 tribes into one kingdom. When David's son Solomon became king, he followed God's instructions to build a temple in Jerusalem, the capital city. However, after Solomon died, a disagreement arose between the tribes, and the kingdom split in two. Israel became the name of the northern kingdom alone, and Judah became the name of the southern kingdom. So we should have answered quite a few of these questions. Many of the kings of Israel and Judah worshipped foreign gods and allowed unjust practices in the kingdom. So God called prophets to encourage the people to obey their covenant with him. Prophets like Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah reminded God's chosen people to stop worshiping idols, to practice justice, and to care for those in need. Let justice flow like a stream and righteousness like a river that never goes dry. Amos chapter 5, verse 24. So I'm going to give us a moment to fill in a lot of these questions I just read the answers to. So look at chapter 1, Gabby. So lift everything up and see if it turns up. It might be hiding between some books. So look at that question 1. The 5th stage of salvation history teaches about the kingdoms of blank and blank. So go back to that beginning reading and fill in the blanks with the correct words. Go double check again. I love how quietly we are working on our filling in the blanks here. So on our reading guide, I'm going to give us 3 silent cheers. Keep working quietly. All right, I know we might not have it all filled in yet, but I'm going to move on to stage 6, the exile and the return. The 6th stage of salvation history covers the exile and the return from the exile. You can learn about these events in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and some of the later prophets. Despite the prophet's warnings, the people of Israel and Judah continued to turn away from God's covenant. So God let their kingdoms be conquered. Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in 721 BC. Judah was conquered by the Babylonians in 587 BC. We call this time the exile because many of God's people were taken into captivity. During the exile, prophets like Ezekiel comforted the Israelites with the promise that God was still with them. The prophets also foretold the coming of a Savior or Messiah who could lead the people to peace. 50 years passed in exile. Then a new Persian king conquered Babylon and allowed God's chosen people, now called Judeans or Jews, to return to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. After Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, the Greeks ruled Israel. But around 150 BC, the Maccabees, a Jewish family, led a successful revolt against the Greeks to restore Jewish independence. During all of these troubled times, many of the chosen people continued to hope for a Messiah to make them great again. So you can see that there's a lot of times when the people turned away from God, and that's when they had the trouble. That's when they were in exile. They were being conquered. And when they had faith in God, that's when things started to go their way again. So always keep that faith in God. I'll let you work a couple more minutes and then we're going to move on into math. So I'm going to stop the recording.